God sometimes gets a bad rap in the Old Testament, and I think it's unfair. So let's think about the overall story with its key moments. God creates two people, and He loves them. They have one instruction: don't eat from that tree, because I want you to trust me, or you'll die. He wants them to be faithful to Him is the only thing they need, and knows that with unfaithfulness comes death. But the two people eat from the tree anyway. God could have let them physically die right there. Poof, back to the dust. Then you start over. There are other examples in other cultural mythology about this sort of thing happening, but He doesn't, because He loves them. He doesn't want a replacement. He wants them. Instead, He shows grace by letting them live and have lives and children, but just not in Eden. I don't think it would have been grace to let them continue living in the garden, eating from everything, including the tree of life. After all, who wants to live in a sinful state forever? Instead, He sends them out. But before that, He clothes them. He says, here, you're going to need this. He had a plan to win people back, but He also wanted people to want to come back. After all, sin is rebellion, and He wanted people who were not rebellious. So the story unfolds, the world becomes populated, and He chooses from among them the man Abraham, and gives him an offer. Come with me, and I'll make you the father of a nation. I see this as analogous to the New Testament depictions of Jesus and the church as His bride. God calls Abraham into a relationship too. But I ask you to be faithful, He says. Abraham says yes, and off they go. God eventually sends them the family to Egypt at some point for preservation, where resources abound and they can grow into a nation of people. Then God calls Moses and says, would you be my guy to lead my people out of Egypt? God wanted to call out His nation, His people, from a land of enslavement, cleanse them as they pass through the waters of the Red Sea, and give them the offer He gave Abraham. Follow me, and I'll be your God. I'll take care of you. I'll show you how to live in a way where you can flourish. I'll even give you a new Eden, the promised land. I'll be all you'll ever need. But I ask you to be faithful. Of course, they weren't entirely faithful. For hundreds of years, many hundreds of years, they waxed and waned in their faithfulness to the God who saved them. Time and again, God reminded them, you said you would be faithful. We made a covenant. Right now, you're being unfaithful. If you keep this up, bad things will happen. But if you turn it around, I'll be right here waiting for you with open arms. He showed them grace for hundreds of years, displaying tremendous patience with His unfaithful bride. Eventually He had enough and punished them for their rebelliousness. After all, God's not a pushover. But even then, He promised that one day He would rescue them. Another sign of grace. And bring them back to that wonderful place. And they would be His people again, and He would be their God. He promised to give them hearts of flesh and not stone. He promised that I will put my Spirit within you, so that they could finally be faithful to Him. For God to put His Spirit in someone, they were going to need some cleansing. So He promised a Messiah who would come and make everything right. And He eventually rescued and restored them back to their old land. Jesus came as that Messiah. Fully human, He understood all the temptations that people face, but being fully God, He didn't succumb to them. He knew that in order for humanity to be right with God again, which was God's goal all along, there would need to be a sacrifice to cover all of that sin. Sacrifices in the Old Testament punctuated the fact that sin is serious, and there's no more serious illustration of that than death. Fully human, Jesus could die as a human representative to atone for the sin of humans. Fully God, He could do so as a perfect sacrifice without blemish, the only one who didn't deserve to die. His death was the ultimate sign of God's grace. that somebody else would receive the punishment that every person deserves. Now, if Jesus had stayed dead, then Satan would truly be the ruler of this world, and the fruits of his labor, sin and death, would have the final say over everything. So Jesus' resurrection robbed evil of that authority and demonstrated his own authority over all things, including death. His victory over death paved the way for the rest of humanity to attain victory over death too. The ultimate sign of grace was shown when God promised that anybody who comes to him and is faithful to him will be fully restored because Jesus died for their sin to be erased. He promised that he is all we will ever need. He just asks us to be faithful. But this isn't the end of the story. Redemption isn't only about restoring people. The epilogue is at the end. God doesn't ask us to be faithful to him just so that we can continue to exist in a nasty fallen world. He promises that he will live in and among his people, working in a restored partnership that harkens back to Genesis 2 in the garden. Together, God and his people will reclaim all that was lost, redeeming every element of creation and society back to the way it was originally meant to be. Revelation describes a new earth and a new Jerusalem, where God's no longer unseen, but the light of his glory illuminates everything. The city's decadent in its appearance, but ultimately in it, God is all we will ever need.